Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We are here today to have an educational discussion on consent education that goes into the different lenses of consent, different ways to view consent, as well as some ways that we personally have tried to maneuver through the avenues of consent. Before we really get started with this conversation, obviously a trigger warning. Some things may come up in terms of survivors and some more intimate descriptions of maybe our own experiences. So if at any point that's triggering for you or just kind of a little too hard, obviously click off the video. Your mental health is more important than listening to that discussion if it's a little too much. But otherwise, we're going to jump right in.
Hi, everybody. My name is Danielle, and I'm a junior in Industrial and Systems Engineering, and I'm also a Bobcat Student Orientation Leader and currently serving as the Interim Vice President of Student Senate. And I think that consent is a really important topic, so I'm glad you're here with us today to talk about it.
My name is Maxine. I'm going to my third year in mechanical engineering. I've been a part of Student Senate. I've also been a learning community leader and an SI leader the past 2 years. And I think instant consent is also a very important topic, especially as we go forward in a virtual environment.
My name is Grant. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a junior in psychology and political science. I'm also a resident assistant as well as a member of Better Bystanders. So I do a lot of work with consent as well as consent education.
Hey y'all, my name is Teapot. I'm going into my last year at Ohio University. I study psychology. I am currently a resident assistant as well as a staff member in the LGBT Center as well as a Peer Links mentor, on top of being the president of OU's undergrad LGBT organization and the treasurer for Faces Modeling, the secretary and treasurer for BSOC, historian for Ebony Mines. I promise y'all that's everything I'm a part of. On top of me as well being a certified survivor advocate in Southeast Ohio.
So kind of starting out, do we kind of want to talk about what our definitions of consent are? Obviously, consent is a very ambiguous term for a lot of people. And so kind of at the start setting out like what we consider to be consent might be helpful for people watching.
The first thing that comes to mind with my definition is the acronym FACE, which I first saw like when I first got to campus, of fully conscious, acting freely, clear, and enthusiastic. So making sure that you have all of those. It's not just a hesitant yes, it's an enthusiastic yes. I think the quote is actually, it's not just a yes, it's a hell yeah. So I think that's like encompasses a lot of that ambiguity that people face.
Being part of bystanders, the FACE model is kind of what we push in terms of consent because, as I said, like consent's kind of ambiguous. So it's a little hard sometimes. Like clear intent can be different depending on what the relationship's at, what the conversation level of everyone is, but it's a good model in terms of setting out, am I fully conscious? Am I acting freely? Do I feel like there's clear intent? And am I making sure that there's clear intent?
When I think of consent, I feel like we all got this talk from Jenny Hall Jones, but I think we all remember the pizza talk about how you got to agree what toppings y'all want on the pizza before you order the pizza. Like if y'all can't agree, well, nobody gets pizza. Or you're going to have to go eat your own. You're going to have to order your own pizza, and I'm going to get my own pizza. And we're going to do our own things and go our separate ways while we eat our own pizzas. I do feel like consent is a lot. When it's verbal, it's easy, but I know when it's not verbal, it's really hard. Well, like she said, you need a good old hell yeah, like it's a go. Like we're on go for this to know it's really a go.
I think what stands out to me with the pizza talk also is that there's that requirement for clear and open and mature conversation before anything happens at all. And you have to be willing to sit down and have those sometimes uncomfortable conversations, because if you're not willing to do that, then you probably shouldn't be willing to do anything else.
A lot of people, especially people that I talk to both as a better bystander sometimes, but even just within my friend groups, is like, how do I talk about it? Like I've had a lot of, especially my guy friends, where they're like, oh, well, it feels awkward to ask before going in for a kiss or stuff like that. And I've realized, especially on campuses, that's normally where a lot of the issue comes in, is assuming consent and not having any verbal indication that there is consent.
I think it's also like a lot of kids in college are meeting new people and they're assuming that they can read body language of someone they don't know yet or someone they don't know that well yet. And I think that's also where like that verbal communication is so important because if you're going on a first date with someone, there's no way they can read your body language clearly.
I often feel like we talk about consent in situations where you're with someone new or you've just met a person, but I do want to recognize that consent can often happen in established relationships. And I think that that's a common misconception that being in a relationship with someone automatically gives you their consent for anything. And that's not true. You know, every time you still have to ask and make sure that they are, you know, fully conscious and have clear intent and are enthusiastic and all of that.
It's also kind of interesting too that a lot of people feel more comfortable making an advance and being wrong over not making an advance at all. And I think that's a very, very problematic, but also very interesting feeling that a lot of people have. Where I'll have a lot of friends who will say like, well, I'd rather go in for a hug and them not want a hug than not go for a hug or kiss, but they wanted it. And to me, that feels like the opposite of what you should, because you can always fix that misconception. I mean, I've had dates, for example, where like, oh, they were like, why didn't you hug me? And I'm like, oh, I just didn't know. And then that's the end of it. Whereas if you go for that hug, I've had friends where they're like, I feel uncomfortable now.
I think another common misunderstanding that I often see is that a pressured yes is not a yes. And so even if you're getting a verbal confirmation, if it's because you've been pressuring someone or if you've been pressured and then you feel like you have to give that verbal confirmation, that is not a yes and that is not consent. And that kind of goes with that. It's not just yes, it's hell yeah that Maxine referred to.
It's crazy to hear all these stories now too where girls are like, oh my God, I didn't realize like this was not me really consenting, because they're like, I was pressured into saying yes. Like I didn't want this, but it happened. But this isn't what I wanted because I was pressured. And so I love the fact that you brought that up, because that's something that's always stuck with me. Like, well, I'd be like, did you want to be there? And they're like, no, but I felt bad, or I would have felt this way, or they would have felt this way if I said no.
I think going off of that too, it's like that's why defining consent can be so important, not to just prevent sexual assault from happening, but also to help survivors realizing that what happened to them was not okay. I know like through friends and stuff like that, it can be really hard sometimes to think that something that happened to them was okay because of this or that. But when you get into the definition of consent, it can be like it wasn't their fault. If we talk about like a pressured yes, like that can feel so like painful to yourself that like, well, it wasn't their fault. I did eventually say yes. So like that's on me. Instead of like being able to define consent and then realizing it's not their fault, it's on the other person.
When we talk about drinking and stuff and how that impacts consent, I think that really, especially on college campuses, can feed into the victim blaming culture that we often have, where it's, oh, well, both of them were drunk, or, oh, well, she got drunk, what have you, he got drunk, whatever. And I think that's also a very hard area of consent to talk about, because how do you maneuver the multiple different scenarios? You've got scenarios where one is drunk and the other isn't, both are drunk, one is less drunk than the other. And I've had a lot of people, especially in Better Bystanders, where they're just like, what do I do about that? And I just say, just don't do anything when you're drunk. Like, obviously that's easier said than done, but in a world where you might not know the person, in a world where consent can be so ambiguous sometimes, it's better to just save it for another time.
That also goes into like bystander intervention. Like even if you're not involved in the direct situation, if you're looking on a situation and it might not like stick right with you, for example, if both of them are drunk but they both seem okay with it, like do you intervene? I think as a bystander it's also really important that those questionable situations are still a place where you should still be interacting and engaging with the situation.
It costs nothing to believe a victim, right? Like you don't have a hand in the legal process, you don't have a hand in the disciplinary process. So at that point, there's no reason not to start by believing. And I understand, especially with how we as a society are structured, where we want burden of proof and we want proof before proven guilty. But I think in a world where we are just bystanders and we don't have a say in that disciplinary process, the best we can do is just leave the victim and just give them that space to tell their story, to be able to have that autonomy that allows them to make that decision of, do I look through the police? Do I look through the legal system? Or do I just say my story and feel content enough that people know?